All right, you're watching PM Agenda. It's 2 weeks, well, since yesterday, 2 weeks yesterday, since the South Australian blackout, that blackout that knocked out the electricity for the entire state. 2 weeks on, there are plenty of arguments still going on about exactly what happened and why, but also about how to prevent this sort of thing happening in the future. We're also getting a few more details now about the cost this has had on industry as well. And with me now is the Minister for Industry and Innovation, Greg Hunt. Thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Let me start
on this cost question. Some of the big, heavy industry like Arium, they are now the steelmaker. They are back up and running.
Correct.
But are they running 100% operations?
So I met with the general manager of the Whyalla steel plant today. They are running. They have no spare capacity in case there's any disruption to their electricity. They've had to bring in, fly in and truck in 20 megawatts of diesel capacity. We, of course, offered the South Australian government to use the RAAF to fly in from Tasmania. They declined, so the firm went about it themselves. Very strange decision. Secondly, we know that Arium has lost about $30 million.
$30 million? $30
million for a firm at a critical time in its history.
And some of the other industries and even small businesses, what sort of costs have been racked up now?
Well, in Port Lincoln, the Possum Corner store, as it's known, lost $20,000 when its refrigerators went down and all of its food was spoiled. Now, who knows what will be covered by insurance, but it has a huge cash flow effect as well as the loss of stock because they lost internet, they lost FPOS, they lost lighting, they lost telecommunications. People weren't moving, so it had a huge impact on their cash flow as well as $20,000 directly.
Now, clearly no one wants this to happen again. No side of politics wants this sort of blackout to happen again. Labor and the Greens, in particular Sam Dastyari and Larissa Waters in the Senate yesterday, have tabled a motion in which they're calling for a committee to investigate a number of things, including whether regulated planned closures of electricity generation and some industry could alleviate this sort of problem in the future.
So this is an extraordinary proposition, and I think that it's unique in Australian history where we're talking about regulated planned closures of electricity generation and other industrial assets. What does that mean? It means deliberately closing steel plants, deliberately closing lead smelters, deliberately closing an aluminium plant, essentially deliberately closing blue-collar employers on a grand scale. In the week where we have just followed from the terrible loss of jobs in the automotive sector, now what Labor is saying is we're going to throw all these workers on the scrap heap, we're going to drive power stations out of business, and we want to drive industrial firms out of business. I would say to Bill Shorten, rule this out today. Rule out forced government closures of private sector businesses.
Because in fairness, he's not, well, the senators aren't saying this is what they want to do, but they want it looked into, whether this could help.
Look, when Sam Dastyari says he wants to examine forced closure of industrial assets, in other words, steel, aluminium, lead, could be other forms of heavy manufacturing such as cement, what he's saying is let's get rid of them. It's not just an accident. This is their path to deindustrialising so much of not just South Australia but Australian industry, and it's an extraordinary proposition from a party that was created by the unions and for the workers, which has abandoned the workers and is at a place in history where it no longer cares about jobs.
Do they have a point, though, about planned regulated closures of electricity generating assets? Because isn't part of the problem behind the South Australian power crisis that one private operator, the Port Augusta power station, was closed? That if that had been planned and regulated...
Well, they drove them out. They drove them out of town.
OK, but better planning, better regulation around the closure of these things might help. Is that what they're getting at here?
What they're saying is more job losses earlier. That's what planned regulation means, where you are deliberately driving firms out of business.
But couldn't it also be interpreted to mean find a way to close these down if they're going to close like this one has on commercial grounds, that's not going to have the sort of impact it has in South Australia?
So we're throwing taxpayers' money at deliberately closing firms destroying blue-collar jobs, destroying industrial capacity,
well, I'm not sure
and destroying towns. I mean, that is the effect. So we are fighting to keep every job we can, and they're building a plan to deindustrialise Australia. In other words, we want to be a country that makes things. They want to be a country that imports things.
But the full motion, though, Table, says we've got to pay attention to the Paris commitments that your government's made. We're
going to meet and beat
the minister.
We will meet and beat our Paris commitments.
We've got to do all of that. Plus, you know, there will be power assets that need to be closed down. So we need to plan that. We need to regulate that. We need to do it so it doesn't have the impact on these blue-collar jobs.
I think this is an extraordinary moment where what we know is that we're going to meet and beat our targets. But South Australia right now, as Manufacturing Australia warned only yesterday, has power prices which are off the scale and energy security issues which are so bad that investment is being threatened. In other words, the manufacturers of Australia are saying, we don't have the confidence to invest in South Australia. So we're trying to do everything we can to actually protect and create jobs in the industrial sector, which is why I met with people from Whyalla today, including the manager of the Arium steel plant in Whyalla, to try to build the case for a sale, whether domestically or internationally, to keep those jobs alive. Labor would have it closed down.
What happens with Victoria, with their brown coal-fired power station, particularly Hazelwood? The speculation is that will have to close sometime next year. How well planned and regulated is that at the moment, so it doesn't have the sort of impact you're talking about?
Well, the Andrews government is trying to run Hazelwood out of town. And what that will mean is, again, hundreds and hundreds of jobs for workers in the area. And I think it's time for them to say, do they want it to stay open or do they want it to be closed?
What do you think? What do you think?
I think that individual firms should decide, and our approach is to make sure that we are reducing emissions, and we're going to beat our 2020 targets, not just by a little amount. We're at minus 78 million tonnes. We'll probably be well north of 100 and tracking towards a much higher figure by 2020. We're going to beat our 2030 targets. So we're doing our very, very significant part. But the current debate is extraordinary, where there's a sense that these workers' livelihoods don't matter, that these communities can be cast on the scrap heap. And we're fighting to keep every job. They're suddenly saying, we give up, and in fact, we want to run you out of town.
Let me ask you finally, because we're nearly out of time, the same-sex marriage debate. If the plebiscite doesn't get up, what do you believe the Liberal Party should do?
Well, I think we can get the plebiscite up. I think Labor should get on board.
Confidence? And
secondly, we're going to fight right through the process in the Senate. I was told on many occasions that legislation I was working on in environment would never get through the Senate, such as the Emissions Reduction Fund, such as the repeal of the carbon tax. We got there. And we got there by working with the crossbench.
Now, you really think this will get through?
Well, I hope it does. I want it to, and we'll fight to make sure it does. And the reason is, this is the first time in Australian history where a government has put in place a path to resolution for same-sex marriage.
Okay. But when you say you'll fight for it, does that mean you're willing to make changes to it?
Look, I won't preempt the discussions that another minister, in terms of George Brandis, the Attorney-General, is having and will have. What I will say is this matters. This is a chance to resolve something.
A flexible approach might be necessary.
Well, he did sit down with the ALP, and unfortunately there was nothing
but if it fails, if it doesn't get through, then what?
I'm not looking beyond the Senate. My hope and our goal is to get this passed, because it would be a profound moment in Australian history.
Greg Hunt, Minister for Industry and Innovation, thanks for joining us this afternoon.